we're moving on to your legal entry representative. So, how do you say her name?
Gallery? Is that
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Great. So I'm going to turn it over to Sam and Kayla to talk about legal entities. That's sort of the piece that we'll work on first, and it sounds like a few of the co-ops are kind of thinking about those. So I want to make this as interactive as possible, and then we'll also, when we break into the small groups, we can answer more of those questions there. So we'll give you just an overview, and we thought we would go by, has everyone looked at the sheet that compares the LLC to the corporation that I hand out?
Yes.
Yes.
Anyone need handouts? Did
Maybe.
you get handouts anywhere?
Maybe 2 emails.
There's a whole packet of
Can you put it in your screen for?
Just a quick question. What would it be benefit because I see it listed as an LLC here.
In the state where they have a separate benefit corporation, can you file on the, can you form a benefit corporation, or can you get the B Corp as a stamp that you're maybe? Yeah. It's probably both, but with the what do you get certification on your entities, like one of these entities, or you form one of these?
We're just gonna face everyone so that we're not
Okay, so welcome. So great to be back. I had so much fun last time I was here with Gary at the co-op, and I'm so glad Kayla's here. I'm a recent graduate of Roger Williams. I just graduated this past May. Kayla is a third year.
graduating this May.
So we encourage this session to be as interactive as possible. Basically, we're here to help you and answer your questions. So we are going to start with an overview, but then we do want to just immediately go into whatever specific questions that you have. Now, if they're very specific, like should we do this action or X action or Y action, our first caution to you is that we're not your lawyers. We can't give you legal advice or legal representation. What we can do is direct you to a resource that we think will be most helpful, whether that's an actual lawyer or an accountant. The second piece is we might not be able to answer your question even logistically. We might not know enough about the facts of your situation to do so. And when we do break out into those small groups, we can talk about whether it's a question we can answer. So with that in mind, we're going to start with our presentation about choosing your legal entity.
Okay, so can I just give a show of hands real quick? How many people's cooperatives are currently incorporated or operating as an LLC? Okay, we've got one. I thought I heard somebody else mention an LLC. Maybe it was the co-op that's
the
on here.
robotics one, yeah.
Okay.
Apparently it's an
Anyway.
LLC.
Okay, so we just wanted to give you a brief overview of partnerships because a lot of people don't, tend not to know that when you don't incorporate or, operate as an LLC, you default as a partnership as long as you're one or more persons, who come together to do business. So most of you are probably, assuming you're doing business currently, and you're probably functioning as a partnership, which is fine. It's a non-legal entity. But that being said, there are a few things you might want to be aware of, especially in terms of liability, because as a partnership, any liability that you may incur is going to pass through to each partner, like joint and several liability. So if you have, a lot of assets, or even if not, you just want to be aware that, anything that may go wrong, say, I don't know, if you have a space that you operate out of and somebody were to get hurt in your space, while there is a client, as a partnership, you would all be liable personally. As a corporation, the liability would end at the corporation's.
And that's something that's going to seem counterintuitive to you. You might think, well, if I do something wrong, I'm the one at fault, right? And if Kayla does something wrong, Kayla's the one at fault. But what happens is if you and Kayla, let's say all you sell chairs because I'm familiar with your business model, if you and Kayla go out to Providence every Friday night and you guys are riding pedicabs together, and at the end of the night you get back together, you share your profits, and you go home, and the next night you go out, Kayla hits a car and somebody gets hurt, whoever got hurt, they're going to try and sue you and Kayla because they're going to say, you guys, you shared your money at the end of the night. You shared your pedicab. You have a business together. You're a partnership. I'm suing both of you. So what we're asking you here is to be careful of that and think about moving beyond the default, moving beyond what you already are if you're operating a business together. So we're going to talk next about the two main kinds of business entities that a lot of times worker cooperatives will look at when they say, we don't want to be a partnership anymore. We want a legal entity that's going to protect me as an individual, me, Sam, if Kayla does something in our business that I don't want to be liable for. Not that Kayla would do anything like that.
Yeah.
Are there any questions?
Oh yeah, sorry, well, at this point, is there any questions about what we're moving into next?
We certainly don't tell you that to scare you either. It's just something that's good to be aware of. Even if you're not at a point where you're ready to incorporate, you're still trying to, tie up some loose ends and get a feel for what your business is going to look like and how you want to operate. You may want to, assuming you're doing any business whatsoever, you may just want to look into, the laws surrounding partnerships in your state, just to make sure you're, you know what you might deal with, God forbid something were to happen.
Are there any benefits to having a partnership? I mean,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As there are. A reason that a lot of businesses pick a partnership over, say, a corporation or an LLC, and what we'll get into a little bit later, is for tax purposes. But the big thing about taxes is that, again, imagine that pedicab corporation, partnership, where Kayla and I are working together. If we're a partnership, we take in our profits, we only get taxed one time. Because we're in a partnership, and the law says, I'm viewing you together as partners, and I'm going to tax each of you once on those profits. What happens is when you create an LLC or a corporation, what we call a legal entity, the law looks at you twice. They say, okay, Kayla and Sam incorporated, that corporation, I'm going to tax you. And then, when Kayla and I take our profits from that corporation, whether they're dividends or in some other form, the law is going to say again, Kayla and Sam, individuals, we're going to tax you. It's called double taxation. It's why a lot of people choose to stay in a partnership instead of going into a corporation. But again, there are some differences with LLCs, and we'll get into that a little bit more.
Yeah. Other people also enjoy the flexibility that comes with a partnership, especially if you're just starting up. You can kind of structure your partnership agreement to reflect how you'd like to operate. So you could technically incorporate cooperative principles into your partnership agreement. It really does boil down more than anything to tax and liability. And I think that's what a lot of people's decisions tend to hinge on.
And I think just jumping off of Kayla's point, exactly what she said about complexity is the partnership is very simple. Like we said, you could be in a partnership right now and not know it. That means there's nothing you have to do. You don't have to file a paper. You don't have to have annual meetings. It's just something that you are by virtue of carrying on a business together with someone. So when you start talking about corporations or LLCs, you start talking about formalities, pieces of paper you have to fill out, things you have to do. So the law says, yes, you are a corporation. You've checked the box of all the things that we want you to do. So next we're going to start talking, I guess since we're talking about corporations, we could go through the basics of corporation.
Yeah, sure. You want to? Sure.
So corporations, this is the typical business entity. When you think of a legal entity, think of corporations. So a corporate structure is basically
A person.
well, that's a whole different topic I don't want to get into right now. But basically, it's a group of people coming together. We call them shareholders. And they all own a piece of this legal entity that we call a corporation. The corporation acts as a shield. Basically, it prevents you, the individual shareholder, from getting sued if someone views the corporation as having done something wrong. Now, that's not the only thing that that shield does. Like I said, that shield is the place the law looks first. And they say, I'm going to tax this shield because it's a separate entity than the shareholders as individuals. That's that double taxation regime I was talking about. Now, corporations do allow a lot of flexibility. Now you've heard about stock markets and shares. Those are corporations. If they're publicly held, you can trade your interest in a corporation. You can say, I'm a shareholder. I own 10% of this corporation, but I'm going to sell it. That's something flexible. That transferability, that's unique to corporations. But if you're in a cooperative environment, that flexibility might not have the same meaning, because inevitably your cooperative is going to have things in its agreement about how you want to relate to one another that's going to prevent you from utilizing that sort of transfer of interests.
Might that also be in the cooperative statute?
Yes.
It might be. There might be other statutes that would guide that in your state as well. And in terms of expertise with the statutes, I certainly defer to you. And now we're going to talk about the LLCs, which is a little bit more flexible.
To answer your question a little bit, I've looked a lot at the Rhode Island Producers Cooperative Statute, which probably won't apply. It seems like most people here would fall under AM, workers cooperative, but with that statute, they do limit the transferability quite a bit, which you would actually be fairly limited in a partnership as well. You can't just up and sell your partnership interest and somebody else comes in and, you know, enjoys the partnership rights you had enjoyed. And that's probably not something I would think many people want, especially in a workers' cooperative environment where people have certain skills that they're, you know, bringing into the co-op. So, like a landscaping co-op, for example, obviously I'm not a landscaper. You wouldn't want someone selling me their membership interest and then, you know, I'm coming in and I'm not bringing that skill set to the table like everyone else is who's contributing to the co-op. So, and again, people or states typically, you know, from what I've seen, do account for that if they do have some kind of cooperative statute in place. Does that make sense?
Any questions about corporations? We're going to move on to LLCs. Really, any question at all. No question is stupid. I asked a lot of questions when I was first learning about corporations.
Yeah, sure. So basically, LLCs, it's a limited liability company. So they don't have shareholders, they have members, and you basically, they file articles of organization with the state as opposed to incorporating, but they have that same, I don't know if I'd refer to it as a shield, but in a sense, you would also be guarded, you know, hence the limited liability. You'd be guarded from being personally liable in the event of, you know, a lawsuit or something of that nature, which is a good thing. And they also have a lot of flexibility, kind of like you would see in a partnership, which would allow you, if, you know, you decided to go that route, to incorporate cooperative principles into your operating agreement if you chose to do so, which I'm assuming you all would.
And the tax difference here is the big one. This is the big thing to remember about the difference between corporations and LLCs. Now, if you remember, I said that corporations are taxed twice. They're taxed at the shield, that corporate name, that entity, and taxed at the shareholder member, the owner. And you remember what I said about partnerships, is it's all taxed to you, the individual, nothing else. The LLC gives you the best of both worlds. You have that shield. You're protected from liability. But the government says, I'm not going to tax the shield. I'm going to reach through it, and I'm going to tax you, the individual, once. So it's different than a corporation. You're not getting that same double taxation regime. It's just one time. And that's why a lot of people, especially recently, have picked the LLC over the corporation, because it's giving them that limitation on liability. They're protected from lawsuits the way they would be in a corporation. But they also only get taxed once, and any profits and surplus that they have coming from the company. That's sort of the big difference between LLCs and corporations. Are there any questions about the nuances of that?
Can't you be taxed once with the co-op statute and Subchapter T? Yeah.
Yes.
Sure. So there's another fun taxes. You guys just love talking about them. All right. So there are two sections in the tax code for corporations that allow that same sort of benefit that I was just talking about, where you skip the double taxation. The sections are Subchapter S, which we don't really need to talk about, it's not relevant, and Subchapter T. Now that is relevant to us. That's the cooperative subchapter. So what it lets you do is reach through and pass through to the individual members of a co-op, the same way you would with an LLC or a partnership. And it does so on the basis of patronage dividends, which is sort of like the profits that get returned in a corporation. So basically, yes, you can achieve the same pass-through taxation in a corporation if you file under this very specific Subchapter T subsection. It's a little more complicated and a little bit more work, maybe, than a partnership or an LLC tax structure, but it is definitely an option and not something you should rule out off the bat.
So the LLCs also, they're not under, they don't have to have annual meetings, right?
So an LLC is like a corporation in the sense that it's created by laws. Like I said, a partnership can happen no matter what. But an LLC and a corporation, like Don was saying, there are laws that say, this is what you do for a corporation, this is what you do for an LLC. So an LLC has very similar rules. You have to file certain things, you have to have certain meetings. It differs from state to state in terms of what exactly you have to do, but there are formalities you have to stick to with both the LLC and the corporation.
But specifically, there's more flexibility with
There is
the
more flexibility.
LLC, so there's the requirement for the annual meeting,
Right.
all of these other.
There's other ones that are not the same.
Corporation.
Any other general questions we can answer for you about co-ops, legal entities, corporations?
So as a cooperative, you still have shareholders. Their owner.
Absolutely, and that's kind of the great thing about co-ops is you do have owners, you know, that everyone, all the owners are participating in it, so you can absolutely do that with the structures that are just talked about.
You have shareholders, but you can't necessarily trade shares.
Exactly, the nature of cooperative principles, as Kayla was saying, would often limit, and like Don said, a lot of times statutes will limit how you control shares and transfer interests.
Yep.
Just like to clarify, so with a corporation, there's the double taxation, but when you have an LLC, it's only the individual that's liable. Like,
So there is a nuance there that I neglected to mention. So the reason that a lot of people pick LLCs is because you can elect, you can choose to have that pass-through taxation. You can also choose corporate taxation, and there are some funky tax reasons why people might choose to do that. But the reason I told you about pass-through is that's usually what people do when they do an LLC, but you can actually elect corporate taxation in an LLC company as well. It's just that usually people like the flexibility of pass-through in addition to the limited liability.
okay.
You can do that under Subchapter T.
Yes.
So why, if it's like the same, I know maybe because I love to make our lives difficult, but why would you choose not to become a co-op? I know why in Rhode Island, because they don't have
Right.
the Chapter T, but why in Massachusetts would you choose to become an LLC and not use the co-op?
So the reason that I've heard the most about seems to be that there's a lot of established law when it comes to LLCs and traditional forms of businesses. Judges know what they are, lawyers know what they are, accountants know what they are.
I thought corporations.
So, I'm sorry, corporate. Well, yeah, but both of those are more familiar structures for entities where, so a lot of times it's people like us, it's lawyers and accountants who are like, yeah, why don't you just be an LLC? Because I don't know what about this going on. Don's the great exception here because a lot of lawyers aren't comfortable working with those statutes. So that is one of the biases working against people thinking the co-op statute. It's new, it's untested, or at least relatively untested compared to the better known corporate statutes.
So on the handout that we saw online, it says that corporations are well-known entities, but LLCs are less well-known.
I mean, that's changing. I think it really is. I think that was true maybe 5 years ago. I think now that's different. I think that is more readily accepted, more well-known. And some of the largest companies now in this country are LLCs, so.
But Sam's talking more about forming as a cooperative corporation versus a typical corporation, and that's not necessarily known to a lot of people. But other reasons why you might form an LLC over the co-op corp, that's the question, Danya, was because, again, that flexibility is sort of thought, but in a co-op, you're gonna have lots of meetings, as they point out in that handout anyway, so eventually you might look like, it might not really matter, except that there are more filings that you have to do with the government for the corporation. in terms of how workers are taxed. Typically in an LLC, if you choose that pass-through, then part of the salary is taxed as you're in the LLC, you're paying self-employment taxes on that. Whereas with the corporation, the salary, the corporation has to pay half of your FICA, so then Medicare, all that stuff, and you're paying half of that, so it's actually less of a tax burden on the individual. It could come out that you could do that in the LLC also if you wanted to get that treatment. But immigration-wise, if you didn't have a social and if you're doing the corporation, that's going to most likely require that you provide that versus the LLC, where it's more of a structure where you can maybe get away with the ITIN instead of the social. That's the
Anything else?
Filing fees, there's a $500 flat filing fee in Massachusetts for
we're just going off
LLC.
of what the form says. I don't know if that's
And
sure.
that's an annual fee, I think, and then for corporations, it's less. Is that?
I don't know if that was the annual fee. In Rhode Island, there is a $500 minimum for both LLC and the corporations that you're paying. So we would have to look into it. Just in Massachusetts.
Thanks for listening, guys. I didn't ask about the sexiest topic, but I appreciate you hanging in there. It's very nice of you.
At the end of the day, you really want to crunch the numbers and kind of see and talk to an accountant and then look at what might make the most sense for your members. If you are looking at both the options, if there are other reasons why you might choose the LLC over that, then maybe that doesn't matter as much if you're sort of leaning towards them anyway.
And after one more presentation and dinner, we're going to split into groups, so you'll have a chance to ask more specific questions. We went over that last point really quickly, the one about if there are people without social security numbers, and so that can be dealt with more in a small group after dinner too. Great, thank you so much, Dr. Williams.